Today is Ascension Sunday. I've always found the story of the Ascension and the doctrine of the Ascension a little bit strange. Wondered really what it means and what it has for us today. Jesus went up in a cloud, and in this day and age it means a whole new thing to have Jesus in the cloud, but but now at least we know where he is, so that's good. Perhaps many of you have read the book called The Giver by Lois Lowry. It's kind of a teen, dystopian, utopian novel. How many, just so I know, how many have read this book or seen the movie? Okay. You probably did in 4th and 5th grade and just forgot about it, but anyway, in The Giver, the society that is described has eliminated pain and suffering by converting to sameness, a plan that eradicates any emotional depth. And the story centers around a 12-year-old named Jonas. Not only is there sameness in this society and the lack of emotional depth, but one of the reasons there's no emotional depth is because nobody has any memories of anything that went before. This society is structured. The elders choose people's mates. Everyone is assigned a role, and the children, kind of like Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, are born to birth mothers and then assigned to family units. Now, in this society, they do not really speak of death. They call it the day of release, whether you are young or old. And later on, not to give it away, but we find out what that actually means. And the giver, there's only one. The giver is the one who holds all the memories of what went before. And as the giver is aging, he has to choose the next giver and will transfer all of his memories to the young child. And this child must hold all these memories. So they call it the day of release, but when speaking of a young boy who went missing and drowned in the river, they call that a loss. So there's a difference between release and loss. The distinctions sometimes are very blurred. But we can say, sometimes think about it, we can say we release someone when people are old and they've lived a good life or they've suffered terribly. And we all know at times when we said, I miss them terribly, but it's a relief. And that's kind of a release. And then there's loss, when people die too suddenly and too young. We say things like, that is such a loss. And there's not a person in this room who hasn't experienced loss. None of us. Life is full of losses. And the more that we can face that and own that and accept that at some level, the more we're able to live full lives, which doesn't mean that we don't deeply grieve. We are, I believe, shaped by our losses. I certainly have been, haven't you? Profoundly. And while both loss and release involve grief, with loss there is a sense sometimes of abandonment or of disbelief or of shock. So I actually think the story of the Ascension might tell us something about loss and about relief that might prove insightful and helpful to us. The story that we read in Luke, the disciples and friends of Jesus had already been through tremendous loss. Many of them had from afar witnessed the crucifixion. They were staggered by this loss, decimated. But the Ascension was more of a release. Somehow They got it in their bodies that it was time, it was meant to be, and they witnessed it instead of running away. At the crucifixion, they all ran away, but at the ascension, they all stayed. And the Gospel of Luke ends with the story that Diane read for us this morning. They went to Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. And while he was blessing them, he withdrew from them and was carried into heaven. They worshiped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy. The opposite reaction of what happened at the crucifixion, when they locked themselves in a room for fear. Release, joy. Loss, fear, despair. I think ascensions, and I use the plural, ascensions can be found in every religious tradition. I don't know if you knew that. The Christian tradition is not the only religion that has an ascension in it. And I think ascensions are baked into the great traditions because they help us hold loss, they help us hold release, and they are meant to exalt the leader. Think about in Judaism, Elijah the prophet never dies. He goes to heaven, which is how as a kid I always wanted to go, in a fiery chariot. I loved that story as a kid, and I was bound and determined it was my time, that's how I was going. In fact, many of you know that at the Seder meal, there's always an empty cup. For who? Elijah. In Islam, Muhammad ascended to heaven. He took a night journey, both in their story and their tradition, both physical and spiritual. He spoke to God, who then gave him instructions that all Muslims should pray 5 times daily. That's where that pivotal doctrine of Islam comes from, Muhammad's ascension. And in Buddhism, it is said that the Buddha rose from his seat, saluted the exalted one with his right side, rose into the air, and sitting cross-legged in the sky, attained the sphere of heat, and rising from it, passed fully away. You with me so far? And then there's Mary Poppins. At the end, Mary Poppins prepares to leave her charges, Jane and Michael Banks, having brought much joy to their dysfunctional family. And as the family goes to fly a kite, Mary rises into the air as the wind buoys her up in that immense black umbrella. Right? You got the image in your head? And Bert says, "Goodbye, Mary Poppins. Don't be gone too long." Because I think ascensions are meant to exalt a person, to cast them in divine light, bestow on them a status unlike any other. And they teach us something, or perhaps they help us hold something. The disciples had been through such loss, and Jesus returns only to leave them again. But this time, they're more ready for it. They can accept it with joy. They can receive blessing. They can be reminded of his teachings and hear those. And what happens afterwards, after the ascension? They return to the upper room. It seems maybe the same place that they went before. But they're rejoicing. Instead of fear, they feel empowerment. They embrace the centrality of community. They continue to meet together. They remind each other. In fact, they're so impassioned that they start a movement with the coming of the Holy Spirit that goes on to this day, one of the greatest movements in the history of humankind. We all have loss. Sometimes our losses are some that we will never get over. But there may be times when we can turn some losses into release. Kind of that absence-presence kind of paradox. You know, my mother's birthday was this week, May 22nd, so she's kind of been top of mind. She's been gone 22 years now. And it was a huge loss for me when she died. She died too young, unexpectedly. But I think over time, in some ways, my heart has grown fonder. I think I've gone from holding this great loss to a release. The complications, as some of us might have with mothers, if we're to be honest, have faded. And now, as a mom myself, I realize all that she did for me and all the ways she loved me. And let's just say, being a parent myself, I have much more compassion for her flaws and my flaws now. And she is still with me, because absence and presence are not opposites. You can't have them both at the same time. Sometimes it's painful, and sometimes it's just sweet. We all have losses. I mean, just need to look at this as a representation of a few of us in the room. And losses shape us. But nothing is lost forever. We can move from loss to release. And I think when we're able to do that, we're able to receive more blessing. Because when the disciples stood there and his friends and loved ones, and they were able to begin to open their heart to release, then came the blessing. So maybe the ascension story isn't about Jesus in the cloud so much as it is helping us deal with the absence of those we love and how they still live in us. That perhaps even in the midst of grief and beyond, we can get to a release, a joy, an empowerment, a wonder, a gratitude. Because every year, everything I have ever learned in my lifetime leads back to this. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against you and against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and when the time has come to let it go, to let it go. May it be so, and amen.